Just curious, what device are you watching on? Phone, TV, laptop? Comment below.
They said I'd die alone with my cats. I guess what really pissed me off wasn't the cats part. It was the certainty in their voices. The quiet confidence behind the wine glasses and the polite laughter, like they were already writing my obituary in their heads. Just another middle-aged woman whose best stories stopped at 35. The night it all boiled over wasn't particularly different from any other. That's what makes it worse in a way. How easy it is for people to make you feel small without even raising their voice. It was a Saturday. We were sitting at one of those overhyped, overpriced, dimly lit restaurants that makes every meal feel like it's trying too hard. Exposed brick walls, menu in cursive script, and waiters who treat water refills like a power play. I didn't want to be there, but Lindsay insisted. "You need to get out more," she said, which is code for, "You need to stop making everyone uncomfortable with your life choices." Lindsay was always polished, effortlessly smug in that PTA president kind of way. 3 kids, a husband who golfs too much, a job she doesn't need, and me? I was the divorced one, the childless one, the wedding planner who canceled her own wedding. "It's like you've got this curse," she said that night, laughing into her second glass of rosé. "Like every guy just vanishes, or runs, or cheats." She winked at me as if that made it less cruel, less humiliating in front of her suburban court of fellow happily marrieds. I smiled, because what else could I do? You can't argue with people who think your pain is a punchline. Ben wasn't there, of course. He was the last guy I dated. Fiancé, actually. We were 3 weeks away from the wedding when he told me he couldn't see himself growing old with me, which, in retrospect, is a hell of a thing to say to a woman you've already paid a florist for. What he didn't mention, and what I later found out, was that he had been growing young with Lindsay behind my back for months. And she never apologized. She just smiled and acted like my heartbreak was some sort of tragic character development. So I sat at that dinner, nursing my overpriced cocktail and feeling like the punchline to a joke I never agreed to be part of. My mom chimed in with her usual script, like she had it memorized. "You're just too picky, Marissa. Men want warmth, stability. You can't wait forever to start living your life." This is the same woman who once told me therapy was for the weak, and cruises were low-class buffets on boats. She always had opinions, never questions. After dinner, I walked to my car without saying goodbye. I didn't cry, not yet. I just sat there in the dark, my hands gripping the steering wheel, replaying the whole evening in my head, like a bad sitcom I couldn't turn off. And that's when I realized. I'd been shrinking for years, quietly folding myself smaller and smaller to fit their expectations, their timelines, their pity. They had boxed me into this narrative. The lonely cat lady, the leftover, the woman who used to be something. The next morning, I booked a cruise. Not a group package, not a singles cruise, and definitely not one of those senior-friendly itineraries that treats adventure like it's a controlled substance. No, this one was bold. 3 weeks in the Mediterranean, luxury level everything, 5-star spa, 7-course dinners, and a balcony suite that cost more than my first car. I paid in full, chose a fake name for fun, just to feel like I was already someone else, and called it a gift to myself. A peace offering for all the years I spent playing nice. I didn't tell anyone, not my mom, not my friends, not even Grandma, who's usually the only one rooting for me. I packed 2 suitcases and scheduled a post to go live after I boarded the ship. It was a photo of my feet in flip-flops, propped up on a poolside lounge chair, with a cocktail in my hand, and the caption, "Me and my 6 husbands, all named Peace, are honeymooning somewhere fabulous. Don't wait up." To most people, it probably looked like a joke. But for me, it was a manifesto, a mission statement, an announcement that I was done auditioning for their approval. They thought I was bitter, or broken, or barren, but they didn't understand. I wasn't alone because I couldn't find love. I was alone because I stopped settling for half versions of it. The ship was enormous, obnoxiously beautiful. Everything gleamed like it had just been polished for royalty. I walked on board with my chin high, sunglasses on, phone in hand. The crew member greeting me said, "Welcome, Mrs. Evans." And I smiled because for the first time in years, I got to decide who I was. Not someone's ex, not someone's failed daughter, just me, Marissa Evans, whoever the hell that was going to be. I took my first selfie by the pool. Behind me, the ocean stretched into the kind of blue that makes you forget your last name. I captioned it. Husband number 1 just made me breakfast in bed. I told him to keep it coming. Then I put my phone down, leaned back in the sun, and thought, maybe this is what starting over actually looks like. And then, just as the cruise horn echoed out and the deck began to buzz with life, someone tapped me on the shoulder. I turned, squinting into the sunlight, and saw a man standing there. His voice was gentle, surprised. "Marissa, is that you?" I didn't recognize him, but the way he said my name made something cold crawl up my spine. I forced a smile, raised my drink, and said, "Depends who's asking." He just looked at me for a beat too long. Then he said, "You look different, like someone who finally got free." I laughed, polite but distant, and turned back toward the sun. But even with my eyes closed, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something I didn't, something I hadn't planned for. And just like that, my solo cruise had a complication, but I wasn't turning back. The first full day on board started the way every vacation fantasy begins in commercials, with sunlight sneaking through pale linen curtains, the kind you only see in catalogs, and a soft humming beneath your feet that reminds you the entire world you're currently standing on is floating on water. I woke up wrapped in sheets that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and ocean air, the kind of clean that makes you forget about apartments filled with laundry baskets, emails unanswered, and kitchen tiles that haven't been mopped in 3 weeks. There was a strange silence around me. Not empty, not lonely, but vast and curious, like I'd stepped into a place that wasn't asking anything from me for once. No expectations, no second guessing, no forced smiles or passive-aggressive glances from across the table. Breakfast arrived on a silver tray that someone wheeled in with such quiet grace, I almost thought I was dreaming it. And when I lifted the dome off the plate, there was a perfectly symmetrical omelet, 2 croissants, and a tiny jar of honey that looked hand-poured and way too fancy to actually eat. I took a picture of it, angled my arm just enough to show the edge of the silk robe I had borrowed from the room's closet, and captioned it. Husband number 2 just brought me breakfast in bed. He's already setting a high bar. I posted it to my private Instagram account, the one nobody back home was supposed to know about, the one I created purely for the pleasure of telling a story no one asked for. There were only 2 followers so far, both burner accounts I made, just to have someone to like the posts. It was part revenge fantasy, part art project, part therapy. But as I sat there eating scrambled eggs on a king-sized bed in international waters, I started to realize it wasn't just performance. I was narrating a new version of my life, one that had room for me at the center of it. The rest of the day flowed like wine at a wedding reception where the bride actually gets to enjoy herself. I booked a massage without asking for a schedule. I sipped something with pineapple in it by the pool. I watched couples take photos for their feeds, the kind where they lean in just enough to say, "We're happy," but not enough to mean it. And all the while, I kept posting pictures of empty lounge chairs, sunsets with a second wine glass, strategically placed next to mine, captions like, "Husband number 3 couldn't keep his hands off me during yoga. I told him to save some mystery for dinner." I laughed at my own ridiculousness, not because I thought anyone would believe it, but because it was the first time in a long time I felt like I could say anything and not get corrected. It wasn't until the evening, when the lights along the deck had begun to flicker on one by one like a slow-moving constellation, that I saw him again. The man who had said my name the day before, the one I didn't recognize, but who seemed to recognize me a little too well. He was sitting alone at one of the cocktail tables by the piano lounge, the kind of spot people pass without noticing unless they're trying not to be noticed themselves. I paused for a second, half expecting him to call out to me again, but he didn't. He just nodded when our eyes met, like we were both keeping each other's secrets without having to say them out loud. That night, I chose a small table on the aft deck, ordered sea bass and a bottle of white wine, and posted another photo, just my plate, with a blurry silhouette of the ocean behind it. Husband number 4 booked us the sunset table. I told him yes before he finished the question. I had no idea who would see it, and maybe that's what made it feel so good. Because when you've lived your whole life being defined by who you date, or didn't date, or couldn't hold on to, there's something electric about pretending you're with 6 imaginary husbands who all exist to pamper you. But the bubble didn't stay intact for long. The next morning, as I sat in the solarium, sipping black coffee and pretending to read a book I'd brought just for decoration, my phone buzzed with a notification from my real-world Facebook account. The one I hadn't touched in over a week. My heart rate sped up like it always did when something familiar tried to crawl back in. The alert was simple. Grandma liked your photo. At first, I thought it was a mistake. The Instagram account wasn't connected to Facebook. It wasn't even under my real name. I opened it just to be sure, and there it was, my breakfast in bed post, with the 6 husbands caption, had been screenshotted and posted by someone else. Someone who knew exactly how to dig under my skin. It was in the family group chat, shared by my cousin Rachel, followed by a string of laughing emojis and a caption that read, "Is Marissa losing it, or is this some kind of midlife performance art?" Below that, Lindsay had commented, "She always was dramatic." And my mother, just a thumbs up. Not a word, just that cold, silent approval that said everything she wanted without saying anything at all. I didn't cry. That surprised me. Instead, I felt this heat rising behind my ribs. The kind that used to come right before I folded, apologized, tried to explain myself, but not this time. I stared at the screen until the names blurred together, and then I closed the app, took another sip of coffee, and turned toward the pool, where a group of women around my age were laughing, barefoot, holding champagne like it was holy water. One of them noticed me and raised her glass. I'd smiled back, for real this time. Later that evening, as I passed the man from before, Harold, I had finally learned. He nodded again and said, "You always were too good for them." And before I could ask what he meant, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. The next post I made was just a photo of my legs stretched out on a deck chair, the ocean in front of me, wide and endless. The caption was short but cutting. "Me and husband number 5 are thinking of staying here forever." I didn't mean it, but the weirdest part was, I also kinda did. The message came through just as the ship began pulling into port for our first stop. A small, ancient island with whitewashed buildings, narrow alleyways, and that postcard-worthy kind of charm that travel influencers chase with the drone footage and matching linen outfits. I was sitting in the observation lounge, a cavernous space with floor-to-ceiling windows that wrapped around the front of the ship like the view was a reward, only granted to those who'd finally stopped caring what anyone thought. I had just finished writing a post about husband number 4, an exaggerated tale of a fictional whirlwind night spent under the stars with a man who serenaded me in broken Italian while feeding me pistachio gelato straight from the cup, when the little banner slid across the top of my screen and froze me in place. "I know what you're doing. You're better than this." No name, no photo, just the bland blue bubble of a message request from someone I hadn't heard from in almost a year. Lindsay. Even typing her name now still makes my jaw tighten. Not because I haven't moved on, but because the way she infiltrated my life, and then quietly dismantled parts of it I hadn't even realized were fragile, left a bruise that didn't fade, only shifted colors. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. I stared at the message for what felt like an hour, my thumb hovering over the screen like it needed permission to even acknowledge her presence. The nerve of her, to reach out now, after everything, and try to wear the mask of moral authority, as if she hadn't been complicit in my unraveling. Back then, when Ben started growing distant and vague, when our conversations started feeling like negotiations instead of plans, I never once suspected her. She was my best friend, my maid of honor, the one who helped me choose flowers and cake samples, and even cried with me over veil options. And all the while, she was already playing house with him behind the scenes, rewriting history in her favor, giving him everything I was supposedly incapable of: ease, predictability, compliance. But here's the thing about betrayal that nobody warns you about. It doesn't come wrapped in dramatic confessions or late-night tears. It sneaks in during car rides and brunch dates, small silences where there should have been loyalty, and smiles that lingered just a second too long. I had spent months wondering how I missed it, how I let myself become so blind, and yet sitting there on that ship, with the whole world drifting slowly past the windows and strangers laughing behind me over Bloody Marys and shrimp cocktails, I realized I hadn't missed anything. I had simply refused to believe that someone I loved could choose convenience over truth. And now she was back, not to apologize, not to confess, but to caution me, as if my curated fiction was more offensive than her actual betrayal. I didn't respond. Instead, I posted again. This time, it was a shot of the island just as we were about to dock, the sun hitting the white stone buildings with this unreal golden glow that made everything look like it had been dusted with magic. I captioned it. Husband number 6 proposed with a ring made of salt and sea glass. I told him I'd think about it over sangria. I knew she'd see it. I wanted her to. Because if she was watching, if any of them were watching, then they were playing into exactly what I wanted. A version of me they couldn't understand, couldn't predict, and definitely couldn't hurt. Later that afternoon, I walked the narrow streets alone, weaving through clusters of tourists and local vendors, letting the foreign language wash over me like background music to a film I was starring in for the first time. I bought a pair of earrings from a woman who didn't speak English, but smiled so sincerely I almost cried. Not out of sadness, but from the quiet relief of being seen without being judged. I found a rooftop cafe with a view of the water and ordered something I couldn't pronounce. When the food arrived, I took a photo, not for Instagram this time, but for myself. No caption, no narrative, just proof that I existed in a moment without needing to justify it. When I got back to the ship that evening, the message from Lindsay was still sitting there, unread. Like a ghost at the edge of a party you didn't invite her to, but know she'll crash anyway. I finally opened it, more out of curiosity than anything else, and saw that she had followed it up with a second message. Ben saw the posts. He thinks you got married. He's freaking out. I laughed, loudly and without apology, and for the first time in months, it wasn't a laugh steeped in bitterness or forced out of social habit. It was real. From somewhere deep in my chest, the kind of laugh you only get when the wound has finally scabbed over enough that you can poke at it and not wince. Ben thinks I got married. Let him. Let him spiral in his boring little cul-de-sac. Married to a woman who wears coordinated holiday sweaters and probably still uses Facebook to check into restaurants. Let them both squirm over my imaginary husbands, my cryptic captions, my sudden vanishing act from the narrative they had both so neatly written for me. Let them wonder if I found someone who wasn't afraid of my ambition, my moods, my refusal to fade into background noise just because the world told me I should. That night, as the ship pulled away from the island and the stars began to appear one by one in the inky sky, I stood on my balcony wrapped in nothing but a towel and silence, staring out into the black expanse. I thought about the men I dated, the ones who left, the ones I pushed away, and the one I almost married. I thought about Lindsay, about her pathetic attempt at guilt disguised as concern, and I realized something that both thrilled and unsettled me. I didn't miss any of them, not even a little. Before going to bed, I took one final photo of the night, my wine glass nearly empty, the horizon barely visible in the background. I posted it without a caption, because sometimes the silence speaks louder than any punchline. And in the stillness that followed, I let go of the last thread tethering me to the woman I used to be. She was gone, and honestly, good riddance. There's a moment, just a flicker of something you can't really describe. That happens when you realize the person you've become is no longer compatible with the life you once accepted as normal, and it doesn't come with fanfare or revelation or some dramatic movie montage-worthy scene. It happens slowly, in the way you stop explaining yourself to people who never listened in the first place, in the way you wake up without checking your phone, in the way you no longer feel the urge to shrink your happiness just because it makes other people uncomfortable. And that morning, as I walked barefoot through the spa hallway, with my robe swishing just below the knees and a sea salt scrub appointment written down on a folded card in my hand. I realized I was no longer trying to prove anything. Not to Ben, not to Lindsay, not to my mother, and not even to myself. The air smelled like eucalyptus and warm stones, and the silence was broken only by the gentle shuffle of slippers and the occasional sigh from someone too relaxed to care how loud they were breathing. I checked in with the receptionist, who gave me a serene smile like we were old friends who never needed to speak, and I made my way into the dim room where time didn't exist, where voices were whispers, and where touch, just touch, without implication or expectation, was the only language that mattered. The masseuse didn't ask me how I was or where I was from or what brought me here. And for once, I was grateful not to have to lie, not to have to create some curated version of myself that made the aloneness feel less suspicious. Afterward, wrapped in a plush robe and holding a glass of cucumber water like it was a relic from a civilization that had figured everything out, I sat on one of the teak lounge chairs overlooking the sea, and I let myself drift. Not into sleep, but into thought. The kind of thought you can only afford when no one is demanding anything from you, when your mind has finally stopped screaming, and all that's left is the low hum of truth. And in that clarity, I started piecing together something that had been quietly forming in the background of this whole absurd journey. A plan, or maybe more accurately, a strategy. Because the real power in telling a story, especially when it's one no one expects from you, isn't in the performance, but in the control you get to reclaim. They had watched my posts. I knew they had. Lindsay's messages confirmed what I already suspected, and I had no doubt that Ben, with his fragile ego and his need for closure disguised as curiosity, had seen the videos, the captions, the rings, the staged glances into the distance. They were watching and they were assuming. And nothing, absolutely nothing, scares people like them more than a woman who stops seeking permission to live well. So I turned the dial up. I started recording short video clips, me walking down corridors in flowing dresses with a glass of wine in hand, me laughing alone at dinner, me dancing with a stranger whose name I never asked for and whose hands were respectful enough to make the whole thing look romantic but safe. I layered each video with music that didn't try too hard, soft piano and slow-burning soul, the kind that makes people lean in without knowing why. And then, with deliberate precision, I cut them together into a montage, a narrative, a cinematic little package titled 6 Husbands, 1 Piece. The title was a joke, of course, but the sentiment was not. Each so-called husband represented something real. The masseuse who said nothing but made me feel human again. The bartender who slid a cocktail across the bar with a wink that didn't demand anything in return. The stranger who helped me with my chair when I dropped my phone, Harold, who had become more of a shadow than a man. And finally me, because there is something truly radical about marrying the part of yourself you used to apologize for. I scheduled the post for midnight, knowing the time difference would land it squarely during breakfast back home. When my family would be sitting in that kitchen, they'd spent years making look perfect for holiday photos. I imagined my mother scrolling with one hand while stirring her black coffee with the other, pausing when she saw the video. I imagined the way her lips would tighten, how her eyebrows would arch not with concern, but with that quiet suspicion she always reserved for moments when someone in the family acted a little too pleased with themselves. And I imagined Lindsay, probably in her robe too, sitting on the edge of her marital bed scrolling through her phone while Ben snored next to her, and I wondered if she'd feel the sting of being replaced not by another woman, but by the absence of need. The post went up with no caption. It didn't need one. Within minutes, my burner account started pinging with likes and comments from people I didn't know, strangers who stumbled across the video and made assumptions I would never confirm or deny. But more satisfying were the private messages, the ones from people I did know, people who hadn't reached out in years but suddenly felt compelled to tell me I looked happy or free or different. As if I joined some secret club they weren't sure they were allowed to apply to. That night I sent postcards, real ones. One to Ben with a photo of the ship's chapel on the front and the words, "Hope you finally figured out what forever feels like," written across the back in looping cursive I hadn't used since college. One to Lindsay, blank except for a lipstick-stained kiss and the coordinates of a port she'd never been brave enough to visit. And one to my mother, with a picture of me standing in a white dress on a balcony, holding a cat I had borrowed from a fellow guest for the photo, and the words, "Turns out, I did get the wedding, just didn't invite the critics." I didn't expect responses. That wasn't the point. The point was not to be heard. It was to be unignored. By the time the ship pulled away from its latest stop, the inbox was quiet again, and my mind felt like still water, calm but full of depth. I walked to the back of the ship, alone but not lonely, and found Harold standing by the railing, watching the wake split the ocean behind us. He didn't say anything when I approached, just handed me a cup of tea like we were old friends who had nothing left to explain. We stood there in silence until the sun dipped below the horizon, and for a moment I felt like I had traveled not just across countries, but across some invisible line inside myself. Later that night, lying in bed, I realized that peace isn't always soft or sweet or still. Sometimes it's sharp, sometimes it has teeth. Sometimes peace is the most dangerous weapon you can wield, especially when they've already written your ending for you, and you decide to rewrite the whole damn book. It's strange how easy it is to disappear without technically going anywhere, how the world allows you to quietly remove yourself from its expectations, its noise, its endless stream of people needing explanations for every choice you make, and how, when done deliberately enough, even the people who once believed they knew you inside and out begin to doubt whether they ever really saw you at all. The final days of the cruise unfolded like the last few pages of a novel that no longer needed to resolve itself neatly, where every conversation felt softer, every breath more measured, and every glance in the mirror showed someone who looked just enough like me to make me pause, but not enough to pull me back into the version of myself I had spent so many years curating for the comfort of others. By then, the Instagram account had taken on a life of its own, not viral by influencer standards, not loud or saturated with hashtags or followers begging for brand deals, but something subtler, quieter, like a coded language for those who knew how to read between the captions. The Six Husbands narrative had drawn in a few curious strangers, along with a handful of people from back home who still hadn't figured out whether to believe the story, confront me, or pretend they weren't watching every post with bated breath. Each comment, each like, each forwarded screenshot was a thread connecting them not to me, but to the myth they thought they were unraveling. And I let them pull those threads freely because every tug led them further away from the truth I had stopped offering. The last morning on the ship began in stillness. No announcements over the intercom, no banging of suitcases in the hallway, just the quiet anticipation of something ending and something else beginning, although no one quite knows what. I sat at breakfast with Harold again, this time saying little but meaning everything, the way you do with someone who's been witness to a chapter of your life that no one else will ever fully understand. We didn't talk about what would happen next, didn't ask where either of us was going or what we planned to do when the ship finally docked. And I didn't tell him what I had already decided in the silence of my own thoughts, because I wasn't sure saying it out loud wouldn't ruin it. He passed me a napkin folded into a perfect square with handwriting scrawled across it in small, unhurried letters. It read, "Some people leave to be found. Others leave because they finally don't need to be." I tucked it into my bag without replying, and I think he understood that was my thank you. Hours later, as we approached the harbor, I stood at the railing watching the shoreline creep into view, like a destination I hadn't consented to, and it occurred to me that the version of myself I had created over the last few weeks, the woman who dined alone in silk, who walked barefoot on marble decks, who invented lovers to narrate her healing, was no longer a fiction. She had become real in the way only solitude can birth someone new, and I didn't know yet if she belonged back in the world I'd left behind, or if she was meant to remain adrift, permanently unclaimed. Before I powered down my phone and slipped it into the drawer where I kept things I didn't want to explain, I posted one final update. It was a photograph, simple and stark. Just the open sea at dawn, the water smooth as glass, horizon stretching endlessly into pale gray. The caption was short, intentionally cryptic. He asked if I was coming back. I told him I already had. Then I logged out. Permanently, no more updates. No more curated piece for an audience I had already outgrown. I knew they would check again and again, refreshing and speculating and whispering their interpretations into wine glasses and phone calls. And I let them have it, because that was the point. Sometimes, the best revenge is not correcting the story they tell about you. Back in the room, I placed a letter on the vanity table, addressed to no one and everyone at once. I didn't seal it. I wanted someone to find it, to read it, to wonder. Inside, it said, "There is no man, there never was, but there was peace, and that I married." I left the door unlocked, stepped out onto the balcony one last time, and looked down at the dock where workers in neon vests were guiding passengers with polite impatience. My suitcase sat packed, passport inside, but no one would find my name on the disembarkation list. I had made other arrangements. An hour later, cameras on the ship would show me walking toward the private excursion dock, dressed in white, carrying only a tote bag and a pair of sunglasses tucked into my neckline. I didn't return. News didn't spread fast, not at first. There was no official report, no alarms, because technically I had checked out, left a note, signed a release for a beachside transport. But when I didn't board the transfer back, when I didn't arrive at the airport, when my bank account stopped showing activity, that's when the questions started, and that's when the stories began. Some said I ran off with a man I met on board. Others claimed I faked my death to escape a life of suburban expectation. A few insisted I joined a commune in the hills outside Athens, living under a different name, growing olives and reading poetry barefoot by candlelight. My mother made a Facebook post asking for prayers. Lindsay shared a filtered photo of us from a wedding 10 years ago, writing how she hoped I was safe. Ben didn't say anything publicly, but I knew he'd be watching, waiting for a sign that I had returned to the old patterns, the familiar narrative where I needed to be saved or forgiven, or invited back into a version of life that always had a ceiling. But none of them got what they wanted. And maybe that's what really stung. Not the silence, but the knowledge that I had chosen it on purpose. Somewhere far from cruise ports and hotel lobbies and the digital ghosts of people who once thought they understood me, I am not hiding, not suffering, not lonely. I am simply not playing the part anymore. I live in the in-between, in the blurred edge of knowing and wondering, and I do not owe anyone an ending. Let them talk, let them search, let them invent. After all, what's more haunting than a woman who disappears, not because she was lost, but because she was finally, completely found?